Well, hi, everyone. I'm the director for our New Zealand not-for-profit charitable trust and educational trust called Common Knowledge. And I'm doing this series about you and childbirth. And today I'm going to talk about risks. Um, I have no medical training, none at all, didn't have any interest, never took anatomy and physiology. Childbirth actually isn't my political passion. The environment is, go figure. However, in the early 1970s, by some accident, I did a lot of body work then. I'm a natural health practitioner who became trained when there was no formal training. So we're the ones who took the weekend classes and a week class, and then we went out and helped people. And I worked with a lot of women my age who had body problems from giving birth, whether it was sore tailbones or pain having sex, or they peed every time they laughed or ran or jumped or coughed. And I worked with a lot of pregnant women who had bad backs, and they wanted to talk about their birth stories. In 1970 in the United States, in the early 70s until the 80s, we didn't have any choices. But the first childbirth preparation classes ever taught, were actually skills-based, Lamaze and Bradley. And in New Zealand, where our trust is, it was Grantley Dick Reed. So my generation of women had skills. Now, you need to understand when you're thinking about risks in childbirth, about really two elements of childbirth. One is the suffering, and all of us have heard it, and worldwide, every culture has an expression for it. Women suffered in childbirth. And that has never meant, culturally, never meant, worldwide, never meant, throughout time, never meant that there was a problem. It meant that women didn't cope with the natural, normal, or physiological pain of contractions. We lacked skills. And so birth happened to us. And if we had a long birth or it was a very painful birth, we lost the plot. It's really, really, really challenging. Labor is called labor, it's hard work, but it can go on for a very long time. So most of us, if we do hard work, may do it for an hour or two, but we're not prepared to do it for 24 hours or 36 hours. So you need to understand that that's the bigger element in childbirth. It's always been the bigger element, women suffering in childbirth. How does the medical profession deal with that? They use medical pain relief. It used to be that you knocked women out or twilight sleep. Then you gave them things that were just pain relief. And then they went into spinals, and now they're into epidurals so that women can be present, give birth, and have no pain. So that has nothing to do with risks. Nothing to do with risks. And you need to understand that. Pain in childbirth is not a problem. And in all of the years I've been involved in childbirth, the only problem in childbirth that has really pain associated to it is if the placenta separates and there's a hidden hemorrhage inside the woman's uterus. It's rare, but it does happen. But mostly pain in childbirth is normal. It's considered to be productive pain, even though for women who have long labors, that barely seems as though it's productive pain. The other element of childbirth are risks. There is no generalized risk. So if we say, aren't you scared there might be a risk to you or your baby? We are making a generalization. There is no generalization. If I'm not overweight, that's now considered to be a risk. I don't have a risk. If I have high blood pressure, and that's considered to be a risk now, and then I may have a risk. If I have a breech, when I gave birth in 1970, that was considered to be an acceptable risk because cesareans were very infrequent in major abdominal surgery. So most risks associated to pregnancy when I gave birth in 1970 were considered to be normal, natural, and physiological, and women still labored and still had a vaginal birth. Whether the risk became a problem, so you have to understand that risks don't always become problems. And those risks that do become problems those problems usually resolve themselves without a tragedy. So in reality, if you look up any statistics in any country for frequent causes of death, you will find, as a woman, dying in childbirth is almost at the end of the list. And a baby dying in birth is very, very rare. It does happen, and it's usually associated to a condition that is not conducive to life. Although the medical profession now has been able to do amazing things. So when the medical profession really got full on, it was well after the Second World War. I was born in the Second World War. And in 1970, when I gave birth, there was only a 4.5% cesarean rate because most risks in childbirth were considered to be normal and natural and physiological, and most did not become problems, and most problems did not become tragedies. So we have always had risks associated to pregnancy and childbirth throughout time and place, and early babies. In fact, if you really want to understand reality, before immunizations, we were more likely to lose 20 to 30% of our children before the age of 5 to diseases, transmittable diseases, whether it was cholera or typhoid or diphtheria or measles or yellow fever or scarlet fever. We were more likely to go to any cemetery around the world before the end of the Second World War, and you will see how many babies died in the first 5 years of life. That's what happened. Immunizations has changed that. It has reduced the risks of those diseases. Antibiotics has changed things. It's reduced the risks of diseases. So you need to understand that modern people want to reduce the risks. We are risk averse. And by being risk averse, we put pressure and demands onto the systems that provide us care. And that includes the medical profession. So when I gave birth in 1970, we all pretty much labored. There was a 4.5% cesarean rate, and those were only done really to save the lives of a mother, because it was accepted that babies die. A woman would get pregnant again, most likely. And a cesarean was major abdominal surgery. And then something happened in the 70s. And the strangest things happened in the 70s. They sort of all collided together. One was the natural birth movement, which had been quite small and localized, became global, very vocal, and very big. The other thing that happened was we started to wear bikinis. We didn't want to be left with an ugly scar if we had a cesarean. And so the medical profession came up with the bikini cut, so it would hide the scar. At the same time, women were wanting to try to have a vaginal birth after a cesarean. And so the bikini cut made it safer to do that, because a classical cesarean, the uterus was much more prone to rupture. And we wanted our husbands to be with us if we had a cesarean, which they couldn't be if we were given a general anesthetic and the major abdominal surgery of a cesarean at that time. So things started colliding. And the medical profession became more sophisticated. When I gave birth in 1970, there was no continual fetal monitoring. There was no ultrasounds. There was no RhoGAM shot for Rh negative. We weren't assessed for the number of risks. If a woman was obese, she was considered to be obese. It wasn't considered to be a problem. If she had any problem, really, it wasn't considered to be a problem because there wasn't really any way to deal with it. So the medical profession began to be more sophisticated at a time where modern people began to demand more risk aversion techniques, because penicillin had become available, so had sulfidamides, and things like the polio vaccine became available. Other vaccines were available. And in 1970, immunization was considered to be life-saving. Immunization didn't have the anti-vax approach that it has now, because it saved our children. I grew up during the polio epidemic, right? So I know how frightened my family was of me contracting polio. I was one of the first 10 million kids in the US that was first given the polio vaccine, and I contracted polio from the vaccine. And they had to go back and rethink it because they were giving people live vaccines. So we have to understand that risks, we have a marriage, we have us, who do not want anything to happen to us because we're modern people. It can happen to people in third world countries. It just shouldn't happen to us. Why do you think we decided that people shouldn't drink and drive? Or why did we believe that people should wear seatbelts? Or that our children should be in car restraints? Or that there should be speed limits on the road? Right? Why are those things happening? They're happening because society, people like you and I, want to reduce the risks of life. Where don't talk to strangers come from? Even though 95+% of sexual abuse comes from people you know, but there was an effort to try to reduce the risks of strangers. How'd that work for us, right? So we can't always reduce the risks. Sometimes we have to live with them, and sometimes we have to define them. So when we get back to pregnancy and childbirth, there is no generalized risk. There are specific risks to you, and you may have more than one. And that is true. And if you're seeing a doctor, an obstetrician in any country, they will do assessments, monitoring, and perhaps procedures to try to reduce that risk from becoming a problem or reduce the problem of that risk becoming a tragedy. That's why people in modern countries have the advantage over people who live where there's no medical care. And I know because I've worked there, not involved in birth, but I've worked for other reasons in very traditional communities. So we want our risks reduced. And the medical profession has become more sophisticated at knowing how to assess and monitor and do procedures. Now, everything has a risk. Medical procedures have a risk. You can't win either way. So what happened after I gave birth in 1970 was that this global natural birth movement unfolded. And a large part of this series is trying to deconfuse what has happened since the natural birth movement really formed, although it did form under Lamaze and Bradley and Grantley Dick Reed in the 60s and the 70s, because those obstetricians felt that women who were low risk and having a normal pregnancy would have a normal birth. That's not necessarily a correlation. And there is zero correlation between the number of risks any pregnant woman has and the ability of her baby to get out of her body easily, or her ability to cope, not to suffer. So we need to understand that when we're looking at risks around pregnancy and childbirth, we are making inaccurate assumptions. One assumption is that women who don't have any risks in pregnancy will therefore not have any risks in birth. That's an assumption. It's not an accurate assumption. It's an assumption. The other risk is if you're high risk in pregnancy, that therefore you are going to have a high risk birth, and that high risk birth, your ability to cope is hampered by your risk factor. And that has nothing to do with it either, any more than low risk women they don't cope any better. The same way with midwives. If I've taught midwives for years and years and years, they're human beings. If you ask midwives, how'd you cope in labor? What kind of labor did you have? They're no different than the general population. So you need to understand that just because you have knowledge doesn't mean you know how to birth. Just because you have low risk doesn't mean you know how to cope or that there won't be a problem. Just because you have high risks doesn't mean you won't cope, doesn't mean your baby can't get out easily, and doesn't mean that your risks are going to become a problem or that there's going to be a tragedy. So we have a conundrum, what to do about risks. And this is where I want to talk to you about birthing better. Birthing better skills are quite unique. There are a number of skills-based methods. Lamaze and Bradley and Grantley Dick Reed were the earliest ones. They were the beginning, which meant that they really needed to evolve. And birthing better started to develop in the early 1970s when this natural birth movement came along. However, the families that I worked with were high risk, and I didn't have any training in that. And the medical profession wasn't as sophisticated as it was 10 years later. And so what we did with the fathers and mothers who developed the birthing better skills, we first focused on continuing to get more effective at reducing or preventing the suffering. So women do not want to suffer. Women are frightened of the pain of labor. That's why they use epidurals. They're scared of the pain. Why are they scared of the pain? Well, there are two factors. One is they don't have skills, so they don't feel they can cope and manage. And the other is that it's been associated to the natural birth movement statement to women, which is don't fear birth. Women have always given birth. However, having fear in pregnancy and childbirth is hardwired to our humanity. And I've given a talk in this series on fear and the gift of fear and why we need to grow that gift rather than trying to suppress the fear. And the reason we need to grow the gift, and go listen to that one, is that if we grow the gift of fear and we begin to feel we have a problem or a risk, then we're more likely to respond either by seeking help or doing something for ourselves. If we're constantly suppressing fear, we are suppressing observation as well. And when we suppress our observation, then we don't often see the beginning of a problem. And in modern cultures, this is very prevalent, and why COVID now is such an interesting time. What do we do in modern societies if we don't feel well? Basically, we say, don't feel particularly well. I'm going to wait a few days. And then if I have a problem, I'm going to go see the doctor, and the doctor will give me something, and they'll fix it. With COVID, if we don't have skills to immediately start to do something to help our body, the doctors can't fix it. So I'm going to take a bit of a thing because COVID's a risk. We're being told officially to cover yourself, put a mask on, to keep a social distance, and to socially isolate, basically. That's what we did. We locked down everything. People argue about the mask, just like people argue about vaccinations now. However, in every country, they say if you feel sick, go home, don't go to the hospital, and basically do nothing. That's a risk that doesn't have attached skills to it. So the skills our trust developed about COVID were very simple. Start immediately, if you feel you're sick, start gargling with warm salt water because the virus lives in the back of your nose and back of the throat. And if you had a severe cut on your arm, would you just let it get dirty and fester? No, you'd keep it clean regularly. And why would you do that? You're not curing the cut. You're not eliminating the cut. You're helping your body heal. So if you feel unwell with COVID and you gargle with warm salt water, you can reduce the viral load in the back of your throat. How do you do it in your nose? Snort up salt water. There are people who use neti pots. There are other things that you do where just take warm salt water, not iodine salt. If you can, get pink Himalayan salt, right? Put it in and put it up your nose and put it up your nose. And do that 3 to 5 times a day because you want to reduce the risk of your body not being able to handle this virus. Now, I know this seems to be off topic, but it's not off topic because anything that happens to us, the more we have skills, the more we can handle things better. So the other thing with COVID, if you feel you're unsick, besides gargling with warm salt water 3-5 times a day, snorting warm salt water up your nose to clean out and reduce the load of the virus in the back of your throat, that's your wound, is also drink lots and lots of oral rehydration. Slightly salty, slightly sweet, and warm, not cold. You don't want your body to have to warm it up. Drink lots and lots. And if your body feels sticky and tacky, go in and shower or take a bath 3 to 5 times a day. And if you're cold, get hot water bottles and warm up. So if you have risks involved in pregnancy, then this is what Birthing Better Families did. We first dealt with the risk of suffering by learning skills that men and women could share based on we blink, we cough, we can all tighten up our rectum, and we could then work together to make certain that women coped and managed, dealt with, worked with, handled, stayed on top of, and felt in control. So we reduced and prevent the risks of suffering. After 10 years of developing these skills, the cesarean rate started to increase in the United States because we were wearing bikinis. We had asked the medical profession not to leave a scar. They came up with a bikini cut or the low-line incision. It became safer for us to try for vaginal birth. We could have fathers with us in a cesarean because they had changed from general anesthetics to spinals and then to epidurals. And we didn't want the risks that we had labored with all the way through 1970, the mid-1970s, when there was a 4.5 cesarean rate. We all had risk, all of us who had risks, labored and had a vaginal birth. But by the time the cesareans became safer and they became less dramatic, women started to demand that their potential risk be reduced. And we started to say yes to more cesareans. And we still do today. We still do. The medical profession isn't wandering around with knives trying to cut us open. We lead this. If we really didn't want medical care, we would not be seeing doctors or midwives or going to the hospital. If we believed that birth is normal and natural, physiological event that rarely requires medical care, we'd know that. We'd all know that. And we would just not be getting medical care. I mean, think about how much time we're sick without getting medical care. We wander around with heart problems, with diabetes, with cancers, all sorts of stuff. We don't get medical care as intensely as we do when we're pregnant and birth. It's a very intense focus. And if the collective mind of our humanity, because 100% of pregnant women will give birth one way or another, and if we collectively believed that pregnancy and childbirth was a nothing burger and that there was no risks, we would not be seeking medical care or midwifery care or going to the hospital. We'd just be pregnant and give birth, and that'd be it. And we'd expect very few problems. But that's not the reality. And we have to look at it from storytelling. So this is the story that we tell. Let's take 1,000 women of childbearing age and just put them someplace. 1,000 women of childbearing age is a fairly representative number. 1,000 women. How many of those 1,000 women or who are of childbearing age have health issues? 1 out of 1,000? Or 900 out of 1,000? What about if we add substance abuse? Or if we're living in a war or a famine? What if we have lots of kids? What happens if we, whatever, have hard menstrual periods and anything, name it. We could have economic problems. I mean, I don't want to make this up, but if you take 1,000 women of childbearing age, not 50-50, much more like 900 out of 1,000 women will have some issue, and they're not even pregnant. And then if they're all pregnant at once, some of those issues go away, and some of those issues get worse. And then there's a possibility of new issues. And then there's a possibility of issues with the baby, right? So you have to understand that non-pregnant women have risks. Pregnant women, those risks can get worse or better, or new ones can come along, and then you add the baby. And in birth, it's the same thing. So we are stuck with that reality and with the truth. There's no way to know what your birth's going to be like. Can't plan a birth. We all know we want a safe birth and a healthy mother and baby. And the next thing we'd like is a positive experience, because we get left with the story of our birth for the rest of our life. So what did Birthing Better families decide to do about this? Because for some quirk of fate, the families that I worked with were all medically high risk. And most of them were faith-based families. I'm not. No medical training, no interest in religion at all. Don't know why I attracted them. Have no idea. It was just the reality of that time. And in the United States back then, less so now, there are religions that will never, ever get any medical care for any reason. And they're still having babies. So what did we do after we developed all of these skills to cope and manage with birth? Well, when cesareans became easier, one of the reasons that cesareans started to be performed more regularly was to try to stop the suffering of long first and second stages. The medical profession knows that if a woman has a very long first stage or a delayed second stage, she's more likely, and her baby's more likely, to have a problem. Everybody gets tired. They get worn out. It's a different problem with a long first stage, because if the baby still has the placenta functioning well, usually the baby doesn't get particularly stressed, the woman does. Second stage, the placenta is changing how it's dealing with the baby, and a baby is looking to take a breath. So the risk of labor and delivery are slightly different. But if either of them are long, both the mother and potentially the baby can have a risk, and that risk can become a problem, and those problems can become tragedies. So the medical profession didn't want women to suffer from long labors, so they were more likely to then start to do a cesarean, because they were safer for the mother, safer for the baby, for a mother to have a cesarean. And if somebody says to you, your baby's at risk in the modern world where we have fewer children, then most of us will say, I'll give my life if you save my baby. Interestingly, in third world countries, they'd rather lose a baby than a mother, because there aren't a lot of mothers having babies at any one time. You can always have another baby, is the belief. So what we did as modern people is we began to define risks more precisely and to do more within the medical profession. So what Birthing Better families did was to try to prevent or reduce the long first or second stages, was that the fathers got really clever because they looked at birth and pregnancy from the outside. So they could see in pregnancy that I was a container, I had a big object in the container, and they realized that when I gave birth to that big object, if there was something I could do that could open my container, make my container more receptive to letting this big object come down through and out, then I might not have a long labor. They could also see what it looked like to have a progressive labor, one that kept moving along and then came to a conclusion, rather than one that kept going on and going on and going on. So Birthing Better families develop the skills to prepare the body. So we prepare our body from 24 weeks onward, and then we use the skills to work through the activity of giving birth. Now, just as an aside, Birthing Better fathers then realized that at 24 weeks they were already left behind. So they developed 10 skills that we should all develop through the 5 phases of pregnancy. And they're on the Udemy platform, udemy.com platform, as the fathers-to-be and mothers-to-be pregnancy academies. So if you're from conception to 12 weeks, you'll learn those 10 skills. And then in each of the phases of pregnancy after that, those skills evolve and change. And then at 24 weeks, you begin to prepare your body for birth. And then you're still pregnant when you're giving birth until your baby's born. And so you work through the activity that moves you from pregnancy to being a mother and a father. And you do all of those things either perceived of as low risk, and you're still trying to prevent any risks that could come up, like you're suffering in childbirth, even though you have no risks, or risks happening like a long first or second stage because your body is tighter, your baby's a big fit, or whatever, right? So, and if you have risks, then by preparing your body and by working through labor, you can still reduce those long first or second stages, which means that if you have some risks, having a more prompt and efficient birth reduces the risks or prevent the risks from becoming problems. And coping when uncomfortable things are unfolding is very important. And I want to stress this aspect of it. Many of us live with really challenging aspects of our life. If we lived that, if we had those things in our life and we spent all of our time going, na 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 na, we'd have a miserable life. So all of us that are dealing with disabilities, personally or in our family, or tragedies, or complexities, the more skills we have, the better our lives are. We live a better life when we cope, when we manage, when we work with or work through, when we deal with, when we handle, when we stay on top of and feel in control. We just feel better about ourselves because some situations can never, ever be changed. I work with people with severe physical disabilities. They're not going to get better. However, there are some elements that are irritating. And so what we're trying to reduce is that irritation. We're trying to gain those skills to work with and to work through and to handle and to cope and to manage and to reduce those irritations while you're still living with the issues and the potential risks. So when your doctor, your midwife says to you, you have risks associated to your pregnancy and childbirth, that's it. That is what it is. You can do lots of things to try to prevent it. We're not saying skills are the only thing to do. Lots of things. It may be diet, it may be meditation, it may be going to physiotherapy, whatever. Do all those things. However, we really want you to know how important it is to prepare your body for birth and to use and learn skills and use those skills to work through your baby's birth journey. Now, this is all part of a new childbirth conversation that our trust has been leading since it was set up in the 90s, and I was leading from the early 1970s. This was not a conception that people in the natural birth movement agreed to, and they have, since the 1970s, been very clear that they will not support this concept. But the natural birth movement has not been successful in producing the results that it wanted, which was more natural births, less interventions, and here's the list of interventions. They'd like women to birth without any of those things, and they'd ideally like women to have this type of a birth. This is too hard for us as women. So the concept of birthing better families developed in the early 70s and asked me to carry forward was a simple concept, that it is normal and natural to self-learn birth and birth coaching skills in pregnancy, then use those skills to work through your baby's birth journey, no matter where you birth, no matter who's present, no matter your beliefs or your circumstances, no matter your choices or your lack of choices, or how choices change, or what happens to or around you. When you birth with skills, you will birth better and with greater dignity and competence. That makes sense. Everything we do in life as humans, if we have skills, we feel better about it. We do that activity better. So that's the concept. And as you listen to this, if you're pregnant, self-learn some skills. If you know someone who's pregnant, share this concept. It's easy. It's normal and natural in pregnancy to learn some skills and use those skills to do the activity of birthing your baby. That's simple. If you're a birth professional, our trust is delighted to work with you. We'll work with anybody. You're the ones who see more people. A skills-based approach to childbirth is not going to rise up from a women's movement. That's an illusion, and we can't continue the way we are now. So we have to change the idea. We have to change the idea from pregnancy and childbirth are normal life events that rarely require medical care to it's normal and natural when you're pregnant to self-learn birth and birth coaching skills, then use your skills to work through the activity of birthing your baby. It's a different idea with a different set of words. And the actions are different. The actions for the first one, childbirth, pregnancy and childbirth are normal life events that rarely require medical care. Women should have choices. They know what kind of birth they want. They should make a birth plan. And birth professionals should give them the birth they want or include them in decision making. Those are all actions. But they're not achieving the goals, which is more natural birth with less interventions and more of these ideal births. But this new concept that in pregnancy it's normal and natural to learn birth and birth coaching skills, then use those skills to work through the activity of giving birth, that doesn't matter whether you have choices or not. It doesn't matter what happens to or around you. You use skills because it's an activity you're doing with your baby. And you got pregnant to have a baby. And once the birth is over, you've got to skillfully parent your child. So it is better to move into parenting by being skilled to do the activity of birthing your baby. That makes common sense. So as a birth professional, just tell people you'll respect their choices if you do, and that they need to learn skills. If you can, give them a handout of different skills-based methods. And at 24 weeks, just put in their note. She learned breathing. She didn't learn anything. She learned relaxation. She didn't learn anything. She and her husband did meditation together, whatever the skills are. Because when birth unfolds, and it will unfold, guaranteed 100% of the time for 100% of pregnant women, do babies come to plan? Very few people have the birth they plan. But 100% of us are doing the activity. So if that woman looks as though she's coping and you're seeing that, if that other person looks like they're helping and you see that, praise them. They may not be able to use the skills they learned. They can figure out other ones. That's fine. Praise them because you know how much more enjoyable it is as a birth professional to work with families that look like they're coping and not suffering or from risks becoming problems. You know this as a birth professional. So praise them. That's what you want to tell your clients. You want more skilled families working alongside you. And if they look like they're overwhelmed and you've notated in their record what skills they've learned, remind them to use it. There are reasons that people don't use skills they've learned. One is they didn't actually learn them. And that's very common because there's no societal message that it's normal and natural to learn skills. So we have to change that message. But other reasons are very simple. The same way in 1970 when I learned Lamaze, we were told that those skills were for low-risk natural births. And so those of us that felt we were low risk and then something happened, we stopped using them. Or when we had medical care, we stopped using them. Or when it became too intense and the skills didn't adapt or didn't adjust or weren't sustainable, we stopped using them. Or if something really dramatic happened, we stopped using them. But now that has to change. And as a birth professional, if you're going to be at a birth, you need to always tell families, this is your baby's birth. Use skills to work through the activity of birthing your baby. And what happens to families that do? They are more likely to set behind them their birth and be able to move into parenting because then they remember their birth as something that they did with a level of dignity. They don't have to use skills perfectly. And the purpose shouldn't be to achieve natural birth pain-free labor with no medical care. The primary purpose should be to reduce suffering, to get women and men engaged in doing the activity of birthing your baby. So having a risk is a reality. Having more than one risk is a reality. You may or may not be able to reduce or prevent that risk from becoming a problem, nor may you be able to reduce that problem from becoming a tragedy. However, our 50 years, half a century, tells us And the period before that, the 60s, the mid-70s, the multiple million of families that use Lamaze and Bradley method, they'll tell you they birthed better because they had some level of skills with risks. That's it. So take care. Remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Remember to share this with other people. It's up to you now to change the childbirth conversation. And now you know how. You have the language. It's normal and natural in pregnancy to learn skills and to use those skills to do the activity of birthing your baby. You now know that. So do that and tell others to do that. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.